Domestic abuse, school shootings, mass killings, ethno-political conflict, genocide, terrorism and war. Peace psychology is the study of the mental processes that lead to conflict and how that knowledge can be used in a positive way. In this series, Peace in Mind, we will be exploring the breadth of peace and conflict psychology.
So conflict and peace are, definitely not to be associated with badness and goodness.
I'm Kim Stewart.
I'm Linda Rose.
And we're your hosts for this series. Peace in Mind is produced for the Community Radio Network from the studios of 4EB.
There's quite a robust relationship between internal and external violence. That may change at different moments in time, but societies that are more accepting of violence tend to have higher rates of violence across the spectrum, and societies that are more peaceful tend to have higher rates of peaceful conflict negotiation across the spectrum, from domestic violence to assault to war. If you were approached on the street and some guy tried to stab you with a knife, and you might push him away or fight back in the moment, or maybe even if you had a gun, you'd even shoot him, and you might say, well, that was necessary in that moment, and maybe we could debate that. But what I think would be more productive is to take a step back and say, okay, let's widen the scope from those 5 minutes to an hour or a day or a week or a month or a year. Because the wider we look at the frame of social relations, the less violence is necessary. So if some country has invaded you, maybe violence is necessary to meet that. I certainly would be prepared to argue that everyone has a right of self-defense, countries as well as individuals. But what happened before that invasion? Was there a way of averting it, and is there a way of ending it? If there's only so much water to go around or only so much oil, you might think, well, we have to fight to acquire our share because we just need it for our society. We're not going to give it up. Well, if we narrow the conversation to that one resource and to the next 5 years, maybe that makes sense. But if we think about all the resources of the earth and the countries that were there before the oil disaster and are going to be here long after peak oil has passed, then you can ask yourself, does it make sense to poison the well environmentally and socially to go to war over oil? So that's the kind of conversation that I think people need to have, even if violence seems like it makes sense superficially within a narrow moment of time and for a specific dimension. As soon as you start widening up the picture, then I think even people who are really militarist would agree we wouldn't want to have all societies' conflicts resolved with guns. And once people have agreed, then we can start changing the parameters. If you say, I don't want to have my school children resolving their social conflicts with guns, then we can start negotiating. I think you start becoming more skeptical of certain short-term solutions. Like people will say, oh, well, we need to go to war, to defend freedom. Well, if you were watching Vietnam, you're not really surprised by Afghanistan. It doesn't always work to invade a country to bring it to peace. And if you were watching the Russians in Afghanistan, you're less surprised by the Americans in Afghanistan, So with the perspective of history, I think oftentimes people become more interested in structural change rather than short-term behaviors that you've learned to think are going to be ineffective, like invading a country. I think if you look at the trajectory of social relations, there's been huge changes for the better in terms of how we're able to manage our international conflicts. And I don't think that that's going to stop in the 21st century. I think that trajectory is going to continue. You know, depending on what ideological and political position you're from, you put your hope in different ones, but almost everyone would agree that we need world institutions for our world problems that will only really be able to eliminate violence if we have effective dialogue and decision making in world institutions. So we'll need to try and get them to work, but at the same time we don't yet have a world culture that everyone can agree on the rules. So that's going to be very challenging and interesting. So I really think the possibility of change is something that I'm most passionate about communicating, because the debate tends to be very fatalistic. And I think that misunderstanding, once that's cleared away, creates a lot of energy and excitement. You know, if it's not inevitable that we're going to have war and violence and cruelty, then what next?